5 of the 7 geniuses, which is the reason so many times people do well in school, but they don't do well in the real world. Or, as my rich dad would always say, he says the A students work for C students and the B students work for the government. And it's oftentimes the C students, and it's the C students who have a broad or a general type of intelligence development. A lot of times the people who do very well in school are very focused on one, academic intelligence or reading intelligence only. Would you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And the one of the intelligences that have just in the last 5 years been acknowledged is that of emotional intelligence. And a man named Daniel Goleman has written a book called Your Emotional IQ. I just read in Arizona Republic today that the U.S. Marine Corps is teaching their Marine recruits about emotional intelligence. Now, why would they do that? One of the things that we know that most children who come through the public school, they end up being afraid to try new ways of learning.
They're afraid of making mistakes.
They're afraid of making mistakes. And so they basically learn out of a fear or an avoidance of making mistakes. And one of the things that emotional intelligence teaches you is how to deal with your fear and get through that fear and do it anyway. So that one of the things that you can learn to do is change the way you learn by learning in different ways. And one of the ways you can change that is to change from a fear of learning, a fear of making mistakes, to a fun-filled way of celebrating your mistakes, because it is out of the mistake that you can be motivated to find out what went wrong and therefore make a correction.
And that's why, you've played Cash Flow with me several times. And the reason I created Cash Flow as a board game is when it comes to money, the biggest fear people have is losing it. And so what they do is become bill payers, or become savers. Their emotion of fear says play it safe. So it's that fear that generates the thought in the brain that says play it safe. And so then the eyes start looking for safe, secure investments. The problem with safe, secure investments, they don't exist. And, mutual funds, everybody's in mutual funds. This is July 1998 as we talk today. The market keeps going up, and so everybody's riding the mutual fund craze, which are fundamentally amateur investors investing, hoping the fund manager knows more than they do. Which the problem with mutual funds, if the market goes up, they go up, and the market comes down, they come down also. And that's what the amateurs have not yet reconciled, is not the thought of it, but the horrible emotional fear and terror and anger and sadness. All those emotions happen to you when you lose big time. And I've lost so many times in my life, and that was one of the things my rich dad taught me. He said that losing was a part of winning. Anybody who tried only to win and never to lose could never, ever win. And in our school system, what we're taught is never to make mistakes. Now, that'd be like saying ride this bike but never fall off. And you can never, ever learn if you've been programmed or conditioned to never make a mistake. So the reason most people are not financially successful is emotionally and mentally they've been conditioned to not make mistakes with money. So that's why Cash Flow was created, so that you could play the game with play money in an environment and learn and risk only play money versus real money.
That's a really good point. And one of the advantages of learning through playing a game is that it is perceived as a game. And we know that when people participate in a game, that they are more likely to have fun. And in this game of Cash Flow, not only are you having fun or potentially having fun, but you're learning a new vocabulary. You're learning how the rich think about investments. You are learning how to keep a financial statement. You're learning the difference between an income statement and an asset and liability statement. You're learning the difference between what a return on investment will provide you. And you're doing it in a relatively risk-free environment. Who you play with can make a difference in how you play. So one of the things that I recommend is that you play with people who are very different than yourselves. Play with people who are successful in investing. Play with people who aren't. Watch their strategies. Because basically, what we do when we're learning in a role-playing situation is the way we would play in real life. But it feels so risk-free. And we can become aware of our core beliefs by the way we play a game.
And wouldn't you say, as a doctor of educational psychology, there's a difference between learning with fear, which a lot of people versus learning with fun. What happens with the difference between fear and fun?
Oh, under a fear-based system, you take very limited risks. You wait until you know what you think you know the answer is, and then when you provide that answer, you look for someone else to tell you if it's right or not.
Because you don't have the security or the self-confidence.
You don't develop security or self-confidence. When you're operating out of a fun perspective, where even mistakes are perceived as an opportunity to have a different experience in a game, then you're much more likely to have an open mind about a different strategy. If you play within the framework of games, you automatically go into the experience knowing that you can have different strategies. Whereas in a fear-filled experience, you are very careful about the strategies you use. In a fun-filled experience, you might try a strategy that you would never try in a fear-filled experience.
And that's why Daniel Goleman wrote the book Emotional Intelligence. And people who are masters of their emotions oftentimes do better in the real world than people who have done well academically but have been conditioned to not make mistakes, to be afraid of it, to be fearful of making a mistake, all those things. So that's why one of the best things my rich dad told me says that if you're going to become a business owner and develop businesses, the chances are I'd probably go bankrupt 2 or 3 times. And so what happened, knowing that, I said, well, I may as well get started. And it wasn't this attitude of fearing failing. I realized that failing was part of the process of success. I built a nylon wallet business, and we were extremely successful one day and then bankrupt the next. My rich dad sat down, talked to me. He says, what mistakes did you make? Correct. And we fired out. We went roaring back up again and crashed again. He said, that's number 2. And I went, oh, my goodness. But there wasn't the stigma. It wasn't failure. It was part of the process. And by number 3, I had made it.
Those are fine distinctions, Robert. And one of the things in my own history, I have a father who was in the small appliances business, and he tried his hand at going up against a big company, and he failed. In my own growing up years, I grew up knowing that my father went bankrupt, quote, went bankrupt. And in my mind, I developed an enormous myth about what that meant. First of all, it meant that our nice little suburban home was no longer our home. We had to go and live with our cousins. But when I became an adult and I looked at my father's resume, in those years where I had in my mind created a bankrupt father, he only called it a failed business venture. And that was an enormous turning point for me to understand that the way that I think about and language, the way that I talk about
emotionally and mentally would make a huge difference in the actions that I would take. Thank you.
And that has created an enormous freedom for me in the last 5 years in order to even think about becoming an investor of my own.
Thank you. What cash flow is designed to do is train you to think about the asset column versus the income column and the liability column or the debt column where the mortgage is found and your bank notes are found. Most people are in debt up to their eyeballs, and they don't know the difference between an asset and a liability because their accountant or their banker will say your house is an asset. And if you understand cash flow analysis, your house is not an asset. It's actually a liability because it's costing you money. So people have this liability column so long and thick, and they wonder why they're hemorrhaging every month. It's because they're counting liabilities as assets and going out the back door. I have Diane Kennedy here as a CPA. What I want to talk about here is taxes, because one of the lessons in Rich Dad, Poor Dad was about how the rich pay less taxes than everybody else. And I think the reality is, isn't it, Diane, that if you're an employee, you will pay more tax, you will pay more than your fair share of taxes as compared to the rich.
Absolutely, Robert. Basically, my clientele is all people who have their own business. Maybe they're an employee, but guess what? They're an employee of their own business. They're still controlling it. And the reason is as a CPA, there is nothing I can do to help someone who just has a job.
A W-2er.
Absolutely. We just call them W-2 people. They work real hard, and they try to save, and they buy a house because the banker told them they should buy a house. They invest in mutual funds because they really don't have the time to investigate anything else.
Because they're working so hard.
Right. And they are. They're working very hard building someone else's business. Now, I may decide I want to work real hard, but I'm going to build my own business doing that. That's a difference between the W-2 employee and the people that I see as clients.
Right. And so what Diane is, and what we talked about in Rich Dad, Poor Dad, one of the lessons was the idea of financial literacy. And if you look at most people leave school, they're word literate, which Ann talked about, the ability to read words and understand words. but not able to read numbers. And since they can't read numbers, they must take the so-called advice, I call it more an opinion, of an accountant or the banker or the real estate agent who says your house is an asset. And because they can't read, they really can't see who's taking the money from which pocket. And if you look at the expense column of most individuals, you have the income, expense, asset, and liability. The expense column, the number one expense is what, Diane?
Number one expense is going to be taxes for the average W-2 wage earner.
Right. And the poorer you are, the greater percent of your income is taken by the government. And that's why when you advise your child to get a nice, safe, secure job, if you're not financially literate, you do not understand where the money is going out of your pocket at a high rate of speed. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I liken it to a wage earner is like on a treadmill, and they're carrying a pack on their back. And the more money they make, the more taxes they're paying, so the weight is heavier. And then they generally end up buying a bigger house, so they've got a bigger interest payment. So now they've got the banker riding on their back, too.
Right.
The faster you run on the treadmill, just the more tired you're going to get. You're not going to get any further.
That's correct. So when you say to somebody, go get a safe, secure job, if you listen to the radio ad, go back to school.